Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Future Human. I'm James B. Barbieri, Program Coordinator here at the Pari Center, and I'll be your host for today. So any problems, just let me know in the chat and I'll try and solve them for you. Just very briefly, a quick reminder to make sure your microphone is muted. The chat is open, so feel free to use it to share your thoughts and ideas with the rest of the group. And of course, this session is recorded for archival purposes, and you should find it on YouTube in just a few days. So today we are honored to be joined by Jennifer Banks, who is the author of Natality, Towards a Philosophy of Birth, which was selected as a May must-read title by the Next Big Idea Club. Her work has been featured in the Washington Post, Lit Hub, Publishers Weekly, and many more. A graduate of Cornell University and the Iowa Writers Workshop, she's a senior executive editor at the Yale University Press, where she has acquired books on literature, religion, and philosophy since 2007. She has also worked at the International Creative Management, the Continuum International Publishing Group, and Harvard University Press. Today, Jennifer will be in conversation with Alex Gómez-Marín. Welcome both.
Thank you so much, James.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, as always, but particularly today, I'm very happy to have this conversation. Jennifer, thank you for accepting our invitation. Because, well, we have this monthly series and we talk about the future human. And sometimes I know in advance, I'd love to talk to this person or that person, but I also make room so that I can find people in my way through this journey on the future human. And your work and your book is a perfect example of why we leave a little bit of room, because it's just a really timely, really important topic, natality, birth, and what surrounds it. But also it's the way you've written the book. So I wanted to start just by acknowledging that the content is so important, so beautiful, so hidden in plain sight, but just the tone with which you wrote it, I believe it's right, it's nuanced, it's deep, and it's really fertile. So, well, thank you very much for having written this book in a way. And as you say, that's the very first, let me just read the very first sentence of your book in the introduction, which is a claim that you qualify later, right? But you write, that's how the book starts, if I may read it. Birth is humanity's greatest unexplored subject. So maybe we can take it from here.
Yes, I mean, I immediately go to qualify that a little bit to say that this was a statement that I very much believed when I embarked upon this project. And in the course of researching and writing and thinking, I was surprised at how much I discovered that was on the record, was part of our intellectual cultural inheritance. But I still do very much believe that it's a kind of hidden topic. It's usually below the surface. It's almost never the main focus of a work. You know, in our movies still, it's sort of a side scene on the way to the climax. It was hard to research because it was hard, you know, it was hard to find birth in the sources. I had to meander a lot. I had to kind of look under a lot of stones. And then very often birth was there, but you only really discovered it in reading, often about another topic. So I do think it's certainly been a topic that people have thought about, but in somewhat indirect ways. So if we think about going back to antiquity and we think about creation stories, the stories of how humans came into existence, these are birth stories, but very often they are partial accounts. You know, they're not the childbirth that we know in our own lives and that we all went through. These are accounts that are by gods, or they're springing out of nothingness, or humans are often birthed by male gods. You know, in Christianity, we have the Immaculate Conception, you know, Christianity being one of the very rich accounts we have of human birth and of its significance. But we don't get any real details of it from the text. And then, of course, it's a kind of elided account of human birth. You have to kind of take sex out of it. And then it can sort of exist in an intellectual tradition. So yes, I very much believe that it's underexplored, not necessarily unexplored. But when we contrast that with death, it's I think twin brothers, what Charles Swinburne called them. It's not given the same attention that death has been given in our intellectual traditions.
Yes, and something that also, well, surprised me, but I totally see it, is that it doesn't, your interest in this topic, quote unquote, doesn't come only from a purely intellectual point of view, but it's also from an embodied experience of actually being a mother, which is so valuable, right? Because it allows us to talk from all these books we read and all these ideas we think about, but also to try to integrate it with our own very particular lives.
Yeah, and the book is very much about trying to bring together thought and experience. And I think that when it comes to birth, these things have been split apart. Birth is somehow unthinkable, or it's sort of not worthy of great reflection. It's an event. It's a particularly today, a kind of biological experience, a medical experience. And it happens at one particular moment in time, and then it's over and we move on. And it's not something we're taught to think about or reflect on or to see as interwoven in our lives. I do think there are traditions of birth and of the kind of knowledge around birth that were more subterranean. Certainly, you think of something like the tradition of midwifery through parts of history, the knowledge that mothers passed on to their daughters about birthing. There was a body of knowledge. It wasn't usually written down, and yet it must have been there, and there are signs that it comes up in the various sources that we see. So the book was trying to think about the degree to which we can use language and think about these things that happen in our bodies and to our bodies, and that the birth is a kind of basis of our embodiment. And that's why I titled the book Natality, even though it's a challenging word for a lot of people, because I think that, particularly over the last 100 years or so, there actually has been a good amount written about birth kind of as a specific embodied experience. But I think there is still so much room for us to develop a kind of series of reflections or traditions about thinking about that, of integrating it into our life stories, of our understanding of what a human is, about what human life is for. But it's hard. I think that these are deep biases.
Now, if I may go back to the contrast between the amount of talk about death and the fact that we will all die, and although it's a topic that some people, of course, feel uncomfortable discussing, but nevertheless, compared to the other truism and so important one, that we've all been born, not only we will all die, we've all been born. Give us some insights as to why there's this imbalance, why death, despite being a darker, if you want, supposedly darker experience in the future, gets more attention than birth, which has its lights and its shadows, but which in a way it's also human heritage.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of reasons, and they're different in different times and places. So I don't want to kind of reduce it all to one account, but just to begin with, I think kind of obvious one is that it's been associated with women and their bodies, and these were things that were separate from a kind of world of abstract reason and ideas and rationality and great thinkers and pure forms. And the pregnant woman's body was the opposite of all of that. It was connected with these deep taboos and that go across a lot of cultures, from sex to menstruation to, kind of the raw physicality, to dependence on women at our, at life's beginning. These were not the things that male thinkers tended to think about.
Yeah.
I do think it's changed as women have been writing more, not always as profoundly as one might hope for or expect, but I think that's a big one. But I think there are other reasons too. I mean, birth is something we've all been through, but we don't remember. So it's kind of caught in this, existential embarrassment of, this foundational life event that we can't access in any way, and that in a way is lost to us, except perhaps on some sort of subconscious level. I also think that, there is a human tendency to focus on the things that feel threatening. So death is before us, it's on the horizon. Our lives are, our birth is now a given, and now we have to focus on keeping ourselves alive. And so death and its inevitability is, it's more immediate in a way. Birth has already happened. I also think there's, a tendency to not think about some of the things that can be happier. Of course, birth is not always a story of happiness by any means. But it has been associated with celebration and with joy in a way that death rarely is. So that's some of it. I think that, it happens, there's a celebration or there's mourning, and then life moves on. And for people who've written about it and wanted to write about it, there's also the demands of birth and its aftermath, that the people who were most involved in the experience were busy. we had the, demands of childcare and, all the work that goes along with it, and that foreclosed certain kinds of explorations that really are only becoming possible, over the last century or two. And I think there are probably lots of other reasons that I haven't thought about. But I think those are some of the key ones.
And I can feel again, as you're unpacking and explaining, or at least naming these reasons, what I felt while reading your book, right? Because this reads to me like a different way of doing philosophy, if you may, right? And your book is called Towards a Philosophy of Birth, right? And maybe that's a tone that is underrepresented, and that once one comes across it, doesn't want to let go. And that, brings me to reading the first quote that you have in your book from Hannah Arendt, that I suppose it's a huge, not only inspiration, but perhaps like the intuitive nugget that's explicated here. So I may read it again for everyone, and perhaps then I'm sure you'd like to comment on it. So you quote Hannah Arendt here from The Human Condition. And she says, "The miracle that saved the world, the realm of human affairs from its normal, natural ruin, is ultimately the fact of natality." Well, this is another amazing claim, right? The miracle that saves the world in an era, by the way, where it's all pretty apocalyptic, and we look for all sorts of solutions and plans, technological and so on. And here she's saying that it is the fact of natality, that's the miracle that saves the world. Wow.
Yeah, it's a startling quote, and her development of natality is startling. And I think it's surprising. She never had children. She wasn't a mother. She didn't want to be a mother, from what we know. And yet she was interested in birth. She was interested in the role that children play, but birth more generally as a human capacity to begin. And part of the reason this is so surprising, of course, is that she had just escaped the Holocaust. She was a German Jew. She had gone through the loss of her homeland and spent 18 years as a stateless person, had come to the US and written her famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which is this, hundreds of pages analysis of genocidal regimes, of the Nazi regime and the Stalinist regime, and of the whole constellation of forces that had made these totalitarian governments possible in the early 20th century. And, it's not a book that you'd expect for these ideas to pop up. And that quote that you quoted is from The Human Condition, which comes afterward. But The Origins of Totalitarianism ends with this really remarkable passage about beginnings. And she says something along the lines of, what every end makes possible is a new beginning. And even in the opening pages of The Origins of Totalitarianism, she had expressed this strange sort of gratitude for what had happened, in the sense that it had brought to the surface this deep stream that was subterranean in European life, in Western life, that really prioritized death. She saw this as a kind of death-focused culture that, some of it was a critique of hers of Christianity, even though she also drew a lot on Christianity, but of other religious traditions too, that were about escaping from the world ultimately, that death is significant because that's where, eternal life begins. And so the goal is really to get into heaven. And this had resulted in a world-denying tradition, culture. Of course, many would object to this. There have been many other articulations of Christianity as a much more embodied and world-accepting tradition. But this was her critique. And so part of what she was trying to show is how totalitarianism had become possible because people had denied the fact that we have beginnings and that we are participants in reality and we can act. We can be agents in our societies. And what she had seen grew up among her as a child growing up in post-war Germany was this increasing sense that people are isolated, they can't act, nothing they do matters. There was this kind of despair and a kind of death-centric tradition that she experienced. And what she believed that totalitarians didn't care about was birth. That there are constantly new people coming into the world. They were creating death factories. And she was trying to shift the focus and say that, yes, all this death was occurring, but there was also people are coming into the world, and we constantly have the ability to change the course of history, to be actors. Our agency is not unlimited. We are not masters of our universes, but we are participants. So this was birth for her. Doesn't look a lot like how we think of birth or how I was accustomed to reading about birth, which was largely in memoirs and kind of birth hospital stories. I had never seen someone make such big, ambitious claims about the political importance of birth. And birth is a kind of fundamental part of the human condition. And for her, it was just a nature of reality, acknowledging birth and reflecting on it, admitting its miraculous power. These weren't esoteric ideas. This was about rooting ourselves in reality and just witnessing what is actually taking place.
Yes. Wow. And Arendt is very alchemical, at least in my reading of her, as when she talks about forgiveness kind of as a power to kind of heal the past and hope for the future. But here we have another element that seems to ground us in the present, this new beginning, which as you're saying, it's not about it's only about the physical and all the biological fact or act of giving birth, or it's not even about being a mother. It's about something that's going on in the world all the time that, again, that brings these alchemical powers that are needed to, well, more than survive, I suppose, even thrive and be inhabit a world that's, it's whatever it is. It can be terrible as in her situation, but at the same time, there's this balance between the darkness and the light, and perhaps that's why you write in the subtitle. I pay a lot of attention to the subtitles of the book too, and you write toward a philosophy, and I was surprised both by the toward. Maybe it's also a position of humility, and also by the word philosophy, right? Because maybe this is a different understanding of philosophy, but this goes beyond philosophy towards politics and sociology and everyday life, which is something I care a lot. Being a theoretical physicist and spending time on those abstract realms, something that we can enjoy and have fruits in our everyday life. So perhaps you can also comment about the toward a philosophy of.
Yeah, it wasn't the original subtitle, and the subtitle was a bit of a struggle, and it was basically a compromise subtitle. As I know, as a publisher, there are many subtitles and titles end up being compromises, and to some degree, I'm still dissatisfied with it. Partly because I'm not a philosopher myself, and I come out of more of a poetry background, literature background. But I think it's valid, and it's also I could certainly defend my use of it. And part of the problem is that, what would we describe natality as? What does it mean to reflect on our experience in this way? Philosophy has become an academic discipline, and with a very specific training that's involved with it, and a set of methodologies, and a kind of guild expectations. But I think I was using philosophy in the much more general sense of kind of reflecting on our lives and thinking about how we live and what the meaning, purpose, and nature of human life is. So it's quite general, and I guess not academic in that sense. But it also, the fact that we don't have another word, I think says something. That word has kind of been become the sole possession of a discipline, and there's a gaping hole there for practices that most of us are involved in less formal ways, and perhaps unschooled ways, maybe wilder ways. That it's not a theology of birth. It's not a theological argument I'm making. It's not a science. It's not a literature. I think also, all of the people in the book, none of them define themselves as philosophers. I think Hannah Arendt and Nietzsche are probably the two that people think of as philosophy, and that you'd find, maybe in curricula. But Nietzsche was not trained as a philosopher, and certainly in his own day wasn't really accepted as part of the guild. And Hannah Arendt was trained in theology, and then went on to see herself as a political theorist. And she specifically rejected philosophy. She, as she's fleeing Nazi Germany, she said, "Never again. I'm never, participating in the history of ideas again." And she devoted herself to politics. For me, as a kind of non-official philosopher, her work reads like philosophy to me. There are others who, don't really read like philosophy. No one really thinks of Toni Morrison as a philosopher. They think of her as a novelist, which of course she was. I think of her very much as a philosopher. She was someone who thought very deeply and originally about the nature of time, about the reality of human birth, about social interconnection, about ethics, about the nature of reality. I mean, these are all things that are a part of her work, and really all the others that are in the book. So yeah, I hope you'll forgive me for using it so liberally.
Well, I think it's more a blessing done a course that you're doing that. And I resonate personally because I swim in waters that are technically not my own, but it's in this, well, whatever it's called, it's being a bit bold, also careful. Well, it's in this cross-pollination and thinking you're doing philosophy, maybe not, where new ideas can also find a way to grow. And so I was meaning it in a very appreciative way. And that's perhaps why it reads as a different kind of philosophy, because it's not necessarily dry, it's very grounded, it's very subtle. And by the way, this leads me into something I wanted to ask you, to invite you to walk me through topics that, well, I'm not used to discussing, even less so in public, because all these sort of academic discussions, well, you can pick your theme, you can pick consciousness, you can pick the nature of time, you can pick God. But when we talk about female bodies, right, blood, the raw physicality that you were saying, and easily we go into, yes, abortion, overpopulation, and this is all in your book as well. And you navigate through those, again, topics in a very authentic way, I would say. You're able to say yes, and at the same time, I'm not going to just lean or bow to this idea. I'm just going to entertain another one. And it's so valuable, but this is not easy to discuss, I would say. But perhaps you could spend a few minutes just dealing with this, I don't know why, somehow uncomfortable topics, which are everywhere. But so let's do it.
Yeah, I mean, it goes into some of the most difficult topics we have, quite honestly. And if you look at, thinking about American political culture, these are at the root of some of our most contentious public issues. On the one hand, birth is sort of the sentimental topic for women to think about in their new moms groups. On the other hand, it's like what causes major political movements to realign, things like the question of abortion, question about immigration, where one is born, certainly debates about motherhood, about the nature of work and childcare and all of these sorts of things, healthcare. And so it's tough. I felt like I was walking through a minefield, and, at the risk of opening up a kind of indeterminate space and trying to hold it and hold these different voices together, I wanted to avoid the kind of binary thinking that has dominated the culture around birth. Birth is talked about in these complete binaries of male, female, mind, body. In the public discourse, I find it's kind of good or bad. And that it's instantly an issue. So it instantly gets highly politicized. And so then there's a kind of language of advocacy that steps in. And there's a lot that can't really be said in public without being wildly distorted or misunderstood, or, of people saying you're part of this other camp, or, you just came a little too close to saying something I didn't want you to say. And so I tried to kind of bring the conversation into some very difficult spaces, and to avoid trying to produce this argument that was like, this is the right interpretation of birth, or this is the right way to birth, or birth is all good, or birth is all bad, or birth is bad for women, or every woman should give birth, or birth is a female subject. Or I wanted to kind of climb below the layers of those debates and to try to think about it on a deeper level. And I also really wanted to get at the variance. I mean, this is part of what birth challenges us with, is otherness. It's an encounter with other people. And I think certainly academic discourse, large parts of our kind of broader intellectual discourse are really about the single author going in, making her argument, clearing away the predecessors, sort of laying claim and striking down the opponents. And that's going to be successful in a certain way in the marketplace and, on Twitter, or to kind of go out with a very strong argument. And what I tried to do in the book was much more about a kind of, I think of it as a chorus. You're hearing this chorus of voices, and there are themes that run strongly through all 7 authors' work that I focus on. Each author has a separate chapter, and there are areas of major convergence. There's also areas of major difference, and I think there's something to be said for not trying to resolve them or weigh in on which one was right and which one was wrong. These were all very brilliant people who had very different life experiences and very different encounters with birth, and were working out their ideas in very different contexts. And what I was really amazed by and interested most by is the richness and the variance, and that this is also what birth is. Birth, we're trying to accommodate someone who has never existed before. In the experience of giving birth, this is someone who is not self, but isn't also completely separable from the self. That's another big binary when it comes to birth, the self and other. And so to think about human plurality, this is also very much a part of Arendt's account of birth and of natality. Natality was about human plurality. It was about new people constantly coming into the world, of acting with them and alongside them and doing things together. Does that respond to your question?
Yes, and it's not only responds, I think it exemplifies when I read in your book, now that you explain it, and it makes me think about the humanities. Let me put it this way. We started this series last year, and we used to call them the future scientists, because this started as a kind of a personal journey to understand this hyper object that is the sciences and where they're going. But quite quickly, it was apparent that into the conversation, historians were coming, and philosophers and journalists. And now, we increased the scope of the topic, and now we call it the future human. And we kind of do the same, but now bigger. Now, within the future human, I've been drawn more and more into the humanities. And the way you're expressing your thoughts and sensibilities is what I, maybe romantically, but what I think the humanities can offer and must offer to the scientific vision of life and the world. And science is beautiful. I'm a scientist myself, but we tend to explain things. And again, I read a lot of books, but it's not easy to find something with that, I must say, pure tone of how the music of proper humanities would sound or should sound. And it's perhaps because of what you were saying, because you come from literature and poetry. And it's so comforting and inspiring to see it play out, because part of the future human, I believe, is how are we gonna let the humanities do their job?
Yeah, and I was thinking about one of your earlier questions too, how there is a narration of these life stories, with which I try to intermix, an analysis of their ideas. And I had an earlier version of the manuscript that was really just about the ideas, and some of the feedback that I had in my own kind of intuition was that there was something missing. And what was hard is that I wanted to talk about birth, the event, and the stories we tell about it. How is this event a part of a larger narrative of what a human life is? And yet, if you go into the sources, there's not a lot about the event itself, even in people who wrote a lot about it. So Toni Morrison, lived during a period where women were writing about their birth experiences more. In her novels, we certainly find it. But in her accounts of her life that she shared in other forms and essays and in interviews, we don't get a lot of the details. She did narrate, kind of story of her sons being born, but we don't get a lot of details. And so what I went back and decided to do was to write the book, trying to interweave their life stories with their ideas. And, this is in some ways traditionally what many biographers do. So it's not such a unique strategy in some ways, but I think what I wanted to do was a little bit different in the sense that most of the narration that I've seen of life stories, and I've published a lot of biographies as an editor, and I read a lot of biographies, is that those stories are told, usually as a kind of unfolding towards death. And there is a kind of linear narrative, even in biographies that experiment more with the form. There is that narration. And of course, in cultures where time isn't so linear, they don't really have, they haven't had traditions of biographical writing in the same way. I've received proposals as an editor from places like India that are wanting to start a biography series because they don't have as much of a tradition of biography in the way that the West has understood it. And that's because it's a different understanding of the unfolding of time. And what I wanted to do was to flip it a little bit and to think about birth as much as death, it's sometimes more than death, as the organizing horizon. It's to narrate a life story with constant reference back to birth. And I was able to do it with these figures. Part of the reason I chose them is because birth just kind of continually comes up in their life, and they are making those references back. But to understand those as connected to what happened in their lives. So to understand that, Hannah Arendt's development of natality had something to do with her father dying when she was young. It had something to do with fleeing with her mother in the First World War and being uprooted. It had everything to do with the Holocaust. It had a lot to do with being a married woman who in her childbearing years was, a stateless person and not able to kind of set down roots and maybe have the family life that perhaps in a different context she would have wanted. It was also, she lived through the baby boom in her later years. She was writing about the baby boom and the things like the civil rights movement that the generations below her were starting. And she was always interested in kind of what was beginning and what new traditions were taking root. Very different life story of someone like Adrienne Rich, who had a mother who she was not very close to and a domineering father, and was born a generation after Arendt. Was a mother, gave birth to three boys, described the experience of childbirth as radicalizing her. She went on to be very active in the civil rights movement and feminist, second wave feminism. But says it wasn't the 60s that radicalized her, it was childbirth, and wrote, one of the most important prose accounts in the English language of childbirth, a book called Of Women Born. And then, her husband died by suicide. So all of these things are connected, continually throughout her writing to the themes of regeneration and renewal and birth and the future. Possibilities of change. I think the chapter is called The Will to Change, her chapter. So that was kind of the project. This goes back to, the binary we were discussing in the beginning of ideas and experience. And of course, one of the critiques people make of biography is that, biographies don't map neatly onto a thinker or writer's body of work, and we can't just say this happened, and so therefore they thought that. And of course we can't. On the other hand, to me, it seems kind of preposterous that we could just take someone's ideas and say they had nothing to do with their experience, with the world they grew up in.
Yes, yes, this goes back to these minute particulars kind of dancing with the universal topics. There's these very interesting terms of big ideas at the same time, very concrete instances of everyone's life. And that's what I was referring with respect to it sounds like a new kind of philosophy, a philosophy that can, as my favorite philosopher, Henri Bergson, French philosopher, said, well, a philosophy that doesn't posit trees is not a philosophy, because you can be all the time you want drawing and surfing all these big ideas, but then we have concrete lives and they interweave. Now as I wanted to ask you as well, as an editor, you read hundreds and, well, we see them behind you, but you may read hundreds and hundreds of books and even more proposals for books. So you have a really exceptional, I would say, view of the landscape of what's being written. And so not concretely in contrast with your own book, but more widely, how do you see the production of books within, and this is a very strange question, but within our attempts to understand the future human? Given how many proposals and how many books you read, are there any orienting horizons, if I may use that expression, that you come across that you think are valuable? Because let me just say why I'm asking this, because this series is exploring what this future human may look like, where we're going. It has to do with the ethos of extinction and other ways to look at what may happen to us. So this is more a bigger, even bigger, broader eye view question as to, well, given how many ideas you read from other people, well, if you have some sense of where the future human may be going.
Yeah, I actually am working on an essay now that talks a little bit about that, the two themes that I have noticed that I get the fewest proposals on. And of course, this is just my own selective mind focusing on these two things, but they've been very noticeable to me as omissions in the submission pool. Not complete absences, but relative to other themes, are birth and the future. So birth I took on partly because no one else would do it, and it seemed to me there was such an opportunity missing. There was a book that was missing that I wanted to read. But the future is too. I almost never get proposals on the future. And it's a strange thing because, of course, the future is important. I think part of it is that, what would a book on the future be? Perhaps in the sciences, in areas like technology, it would make more sense. I think in the humanities, there's not as much of it. Some of that is no doubt because people are trained to study history, to study texts that have already been written, to explore the things that already exist. And there's no real way to study what doesn't exist. I don't know how one would do that as a humanities scholar without kind of opening up oneself to all kinds of risk and criticism and the possibility of course, being very wrong. It would, put one in the position of prophecy in a way. Not necessarily, but I think that's some of the discomfort. And of course, there are penalties for being wrong in academia and really any part of our culture. One of the things I go into in the book is an essay by Toni Morrison called "The Future of Time," and its subtitles "Literature and Diminished Expectations," I think. And it's an absolutely brilliant essay. And she argues that, we've become these explorers of deep time. We can go back millennia. We can dig through the layers of the rock and find these things written by prehistoric species, or we can go through the geological strata. We can think about the pharaohs and Caesar, but we really can't think or talk about 2 generations ahead of us. And part of this is growing up, as we all have, in a nuclear age, where that possibility was very real. That the bombs could wipe out the planet, or at least humanity. And now we have the environmental crisis on top of that. And then more recently it's AI, and it's just crazy, some of the things that are coming out in those discussions, just the numbers of people who have access to high level knowledge, we are told, who think that humanity's going to be wiped out in 5 years from these machines that we have made, these technologies. And so of course, part of the reason we can't think is that not only does this not yet exist, I think there's some sort of shared understanding that we may not exist, and that it's sort of impossible to think very far ahead. And in the essay, she very, very beautifully and quite provocatively challenges the readers to think forward to the year 5000. As being a year where not only does humanity exist, but our children, that the generations have continued, that we had a chance to be alive, that we think future generations should also have a chance to live, and that their lives could be good, and of course not free of problems, but that human life has a future.
I'm surprised by what you're saying about kind of this. Well, I'm not surprised about the shrinking horizon, especially since we went out into outer space and then we turned around and we were shocked at seeing that we live there. So there was this species conscience in a way, and then the perils of just not personal annihilation, but the species annihilation, and this stay with us, of course. But back to the humanities, I would have expected that in the humanities, there's perhaps more room and more freedom to imagine, to entertain, not just futures, just possibilities writ large, as opposed to a tendency that's more associated with the scientific or technological activities, which is more fix things, or warn and predict and fix. And I'm not looking for kind of religious prophecy or even technological promises, but some sort of science fiction that is practiced also philosophically, kind of a philosophical fiction maybe, or humanities fiction, where it's not fantasy, it's fiction, but it's an exercise of because let me say why I'm saying this, because I take imagination very seriously, and I think when you imagine things, it's maybe a beginning of actually giving them birth into the world, tying it back with new beginnings and birth. And so I'm exploring to see what areas of human thought are fertile to bring in these, really literally perhaps pulling from the future these possibilities, as opposed to being freaked out, fixing things, or just shouting, we're all gonna die.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm sure there's a lot that I just don't see. I, of course, can't see everything. And I do, from time to time, we'll get a book that maybe relates to the future. We had a series of books at Yale Press that there weren't many in the series. It was maybe just a few, and it was about the future of different areas. And perhaps the fact that it didn't continue is telling. So I've no doubt that there are pockets of great activity and fertile thought on this topic, and I think probably increasing so, just as some of the pressures, specifically coming from, I think, environmental threats, but also AI. I think it's pressing the issue, but it's not most of what I get in my inbox at all, by any means. I would say it's small, and maybe I just haven't drawn those proposals in, and yeah, I don't know what those would look like. I've wanted to see more of them. I think I have my own questions about what the future will be. And I've wanted to see more of them. And, one of the books I'm looking at right now and hopefully sign up is about it's a kind of utopian vision. And the idea is that we're so stuck in some of our ways of thinking and imagining. And while it's, dangerous to think of utopias because nothing is ever going to be a utopia, just that exercise of imagining something radically different, they see as generative and at this point in history to be a worthwhile, a worthy endeavor. So that's kind of what I'm interested in, are these kind of radical experiments of thought. I mean, that's part of what I was trying to conduct in the book, in a way to think about, what would human life look like if birth was more central to our thinking and our conversations.
Yes.
And I don't know. I mean, that's part of the open space, is like, that hasn't happened yet. So we'd kind of have to go there to see what would emerge from it.
Beautiful. And I just have a couple of questions or comments in ending. One is, it may sound topical, but I'm going to give it a twist. So it's what's been the reception of the book, but I'm particularly interested in your own reception of it. Like, how has it affected how you see, your own being a mother, or your own having given birth? So during writing it, which is, I suppose, I mean, that's what writing does to me. It's transformative of ideas and hopefully also a little bit of my own life. But after it, once you've, if I may use the analogy, once you've given birth to this book on natality, what has it done to your own life? Let's put it this way.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways that's just starting, because it's only been out a little bit over a month. I feel different things shifting, and it's a little bit vague. It's a little bit hard to say exactly what. I will say that I loved the process of researching and writing it. For me was, that creative process was so closely tied to the theme of birth, and the thread I follow through the birth is really creativity. Birth is a kind of form of creativity. And I loved living close to that. It was during the pandemic, where the deadliest periods of greatest mass death in recent history. Never mind a lot of the other things that, we've talked about in terms of kind of extinctionism in the air. To live close to birth and to really attend to it, not in any kind of really sentimental way, but in a way that was, rooted in what was happening all around me, and, had been part of my own experience. I think I had a hard time letting the book go. This is why I told you before we started talking, because I am interested really in conversations at this point. I'm less interested in kind of pontificating or telling people that I have the right opinion on these things. I'm really very much interested in the conversation, the exchange. Is this a kind of collective project of thinking about these things in a deep and often very difficult way. So yeah, I've enjoyed the conversations more than kind of committing more to words. I feel like my written words are in the book, and I'm a little bit less interested in just rehashing those, and I'm more interested in kind of continuing to evolve. And some of the things that we're talking about, in terms of extinctionism, the future, AI, kind of what the future for humanity is, those have kind of come to the fore of my thinking. And so it's a kind of evolution, I think. I'm interested in what the place of birth is in that future. I think these are complex issues because, for instance, part of the environmental critique, at least in parts of that movement, would be that, to birth new humans is to exacerbate this catastrophe. It is, we've had massive population growth, even as natality rates are falling, we have more and more people coming into the world, and humans have proven themselves to be destructive. So these are really difficult things to think through. At the same time, to kind of not believe that there's a human future, that birth is, a kind of participation in a catastrophe, and that's it, also seems part of this kind of eliminationist mindset. So I'm really interested in that. Yeah, it's been fun. It's been interesting. But I published so many other people's books, and it's just a real education to be on the other side of it.
And very appropriate your comment, I think, on creativity and conversation, because one of the practices we believe in and we enact, or we try to enact from the Paris Center is precisely to create this space for dialogue or conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so much an interview, it's not so much a presentation of facts or ideas. It's a space between two or more people, and in that kind of pregnant void, we may call it that, new ideas may be born. And so that can happen, of course, when one is in front of the computer alone, typing early morning. But we humans have this capacity of perhaps invocation, where when we're in conversation with other people, if we just set it right, there's a lot of creativity that can take place. And I'm always looking for those moments where this happens, and that's why I'm thrilled to be able to have conversations like the one we had today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great to be in dialogue.
And thank you to both of you. It's been really interesting conversation between the two. Yes, let's open it up now for any questions or comments one may have. As usual, you can use the raise your hand function at the bottom of your screen under reactions, or if you feel more comfortable, you can always type your question in the chat and I can read it out for you. The only thing is I would point out if you can please keep your questions a bit closer to the point, just to allow more people to ask their questions. We'll start with Hugh. Hi, Hugh.
Am I on now? Do you have
Yes.
the sound? Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer, very much. I've been looking forward to this from a very personal point of view. I was present at my first daughter's birth and delivered my second daughter. It wasn't part of the plan, but I delivered her. And that same girl, the second daughter, has herself become a midwife, having gone through some pretty traumatic experiences that involved losing one of her twins. And I mention it simply to ask you whether you've picked up on the video series, which is available internationally, called Pregnancy Uncut, which are all conversations with mothers who have gone through various experiences and are talking about them. I wondered whether you had come across that. And I also wondered whether you were familiar with what Martin Buber wrote on pregnancy and the newborn, which very many people overlook. They think of it as I, thou, and something rather abstract and vaguely religious. But actually, there is a remarkable passage, and I would be inclined to read a few lines from it, but right now, I think probably I shall respect the concern not to overplay my time. But if there's an opportunity, there's one particular couple of sentences of Martin Buber's which bring an awareness of nativity right into the center of consciousness, understanding the nature of birth as a subject of consciousness of the entire creative process across the whole of the planet.
Yes, thank you. I don't know either that series or the passage, so I will look up the series and I would welcome the passage. I would love to see that. I mean, again, this part of my experience was that finding these things in places where you didn't always expect them, that birth is often there.
Yeah, Well, let's see if there's an opportunity in the spaces that we've. I thought it was rather entertaining, Alex, that you talked about a pregnant void. Were you aware, as you said that, of what you just said, that the pregnant void that we seek to create in these dialogues, and you call it a
Yes.
pregnant void? I'm not sure you heard yourself saying pregnant. Did you?
I don't use the word very often, but yes, it came at the right moment. Well,
Yes.
Hugh, let me, because you made this touching and telling beautiful confession. Well, I also was present in the birth of my first daughter, and I also delivered. And I think that's an unfair word, because I just happened to be there while we didn't make it on time. So I also had this experience of just say, okay. And just because you brought that up, being a man, of course, being a woman, but being a man and being drawn to this experience is something very important and very powerful. And also, because you mentioned the conversations, pregnant uncut conversations that women may want to have. Well, then I went also into some sort of AA for parents, for new fathers, and we were having these conversations once a month, a group of 4 or 5 fathers. I mean, this is all. They would call it what, soft skills. Well, these are the hardest skills ever. Like, just be there. That happens to you, and well, it's a very feminine aspect that we're all trying to integrate in our own individuations. And so, thank you for bringing it, because it gives me the opportunity to share it as well. It's so valuable and so difficult.
Thank you, Hugh, for coming in. And of course, please do share those references in the chat. I'm sure others will be interested in having a look. Next, I'd like to invite Angelita.
It's so good to see all of you. I've been orbiting and away, taking a picture of the big scope of things. And so it's so beautiful to land here with you and listen to your work. I look forward to reading your work. I haven't yet. I haven't read your book, but I ordered it while we were talking. My comment, besides being so grateful for all of you and that this topic has been centered here at Parry, I want to include science, because my own particular work as a traditional midwife and a scientist, both, is that this topic is welcome in the science of Parry. It has not been welcome in other places, and there have been a lot of punishments that you've referenced for bringing this stuff up. I'm going to be hopefully attending a conference in a couple months on neuroscience needs a revolution in order to understand consciousness. And some of the top neuroscientists in the world are going to be gathering in San Diego in a couple months. And I hope they make room for a discussion from a midwife scientist like you all have, because it's time. And the work of birth and birthing is squarely placed in what David Peat called gentle action. And those of you that have been present or have given birth know the power of the secret organ that we don't talk about very much, the uterus. You know that this is one of the most powerful muscles in the body, and it is acting in gentle action. And so I just want to say thank you so much to all of you, and thank you for writing the book. And I particularly am going to just say it. This belongs in the science of consciousness. it belongs squarely in the discussion of consciousness. And it will take a revolution that you've hinted to and that you write to, Jennifer, in honoring subject matter that Alex and Perry are trying to establish. We need new subject matter. It can't be the decolonizing, or it can't be the binary. We have to come up with new experts in new subject matter. And I feel like your book and your series, Alex and Perry, are working towards that. And so I just want to offer that working towards a science of consciousness has been the title of consciousness studies meetings throughout the world for many years, a couple of decades now. And we don't say the science of towards a science. And I think that birth and your book and this conversation and all of our held knowledge as traditional midwives and, scientists of a wholeness, it's time for us to come and take our place at the table. And I don't know how that's going to happen, but I think that your work in this meeting is a wonderful step towards that. So science has a place in this discussion. My own work is the philosophy and science of the sacred circle of birth. And so when people say you need to be an outside the box thinker, they look at me and they say, she doesn't even know where the box is. Because truly, if you've been present at a birth, you know that time just falls out of the equation. And there's not a linear model to fall back on, it's circular. And that discussion is very difficult to have with people that don't want to understand something that is so confusing. So thank you again. I think I've said thank you 10 times now, so I'll cede my time. And
well, thank you, Angelita. These comments to me sound like a really perfect roundup of, like, it helps just bring the conversation we just had to another level just with your comments and your remark about the uterus as this, let's call it, sacred place of creativity. Well, look, we neuroscientists are obsessed with, well, the brain creates consciousness, but what does the uterus create? Well, a new living being every time. That's a consciousness. So so respect and attention needs to be placed there too, to that sacred space, not just to the brain.
Thank you so much for those comments. I loved hearing about your work. And I think you're right. I also think that the humanities need the sciences too, not in this, like, I think sometimes the humanities feel they have to justify themselves on more scientific terms or show how their ideas are scientific. Not that so much as there are really rich ideas in the science of birthing that I think are harder to get to in the humanities, where you can get close to them in the arts, I think, like places like poetry. But some of the stuff I've been fascinated by, and I don't know the science well. I follow it kind of as the popular discussion, what's coming out, stories, but just things like the exchange of biological material, genetic material on a cellular level, how those cells stay in the separate bodies for as long as people live, the ways the embodied experience of birth radically disrupts a kind of stable subject of the self. You can argue that in a philosophy paper. I think when you have to start thinking about it in very embodied terms and in the terms of your own kind of biological being, it hits on a different level. I've, myself have now think of birth in a much more ecological way, as a kind of ecosystem, that it's not two separate selves, or there's this kind of ecosystem that birth happens within. And that's how we have to understand life and death, is in the context of a kind of plural existence. But that's hard. That's easier to get to, I think, through science, because I think the science is there, as I understand it. The last talk on an entangled life was beautiful and gets at this in terms of fungi, very powerfully, some of the ideas that I really wanted to explore in a more humanistic way.
And to add something more into these amazing remarks, in the same way that in the new science of consciousness, we're looking for new ways to even conceive what brains do and so on, we also need the experience to be part of science, right? And sometimes you might say, well, this really anomalous experience happened to me, or I may go into this whatever ayahuasca trip. But if you're a mother, or even if you're not a mother, if you're a father and you attend a delivery, well, this is an altered state of consciousness. It could qualify as that, and it's a very extraordinary and also ordinary one that happens by the millions every day, I would suppose. And so here we have this beautiful situation where the extraordinary is actually very ordinary in the good sense of that word, and yet it's again hidden in plain sight, because we always looking for these really strange situations, but we don't look at this because we tend to put it to the side. It's a bit hidden, and what you're doing, Jennifer, and with your comment, Angelita, is just bring light to it again and say, well, here it is. We don't need to go and look so strange places. Yeah.
Thank you, Angelita. Always wonderful to see you and hear your words. Next, let's go to Todd. Hi, Todd.
Greetings, James and all. Jennifer, I haven't read your book, so I don't have questions specifically on it, but I do look forward to reading it. And Angelita, I look forward to seeing you in San Diego in a couple of months. But on the topic of a conference, let me share a little anecdote from a recent one in Sicily. This was the Science of Consciousness. And one of the presenters in the plenary session was a woman talking about the altered consciousness during the state of birth. And that's her area of inquiry and study. But what was interesting, I won't summarize what she said because I don't remember all of it, but before she started, a fair number of folks got up to walk out, and they were mostly older white men. But what was fascinating is after her talk was the preponderance of folks that asked the questions were men, and the questions were quite vulnerable and full of wonderment. And I took that as something new, that the fact that there was this discussion of birth in a forum such as that, and the questions were coming from men, again, which were, quite vulnerable in their nature. And so I don't think that would have happened just a few years ago, and it surely probably wouldn't have happened a generation ago. So it's fascinating to witness that subject, that dynamic in that environment. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been really interested in inviting men into the subject more. I think birth is very tricky when it gets to gender, obviously. I think so much of history has been shaped by birth as a highly gendered experience. It has been so much of what has defined women's lives, and in many cases limitations, and also, their joys and their possibilities too, but certainly limited the ways they could participate in their culture. And so part of, I think the instinct has been in certain writers and thinkers is to kind of make this women's soul possession, both to critique it, but at times to really possess it. And but in fact, birth is experienced by all people. We were all born. So there's that, which is something that I think is really important to open birth up, just because is reality. That is our experience. I also think that, men play all these different roles in terms of birth. Certainly as fathers, as doctors, as observers, as, participants. And, this is part of their stories too. Most people I know who have become fathers, their lives were completely changed by that experience. And of course, fathers are now often, not always, but welcome to be more a part of the actual birthing experience. So there's a kind of, a set of possibilities there that perhaps weren't there at different points in history. So I think it's I've had a lot of interest from men, and I think part of it is that they have been closed out of the subject. Like I think Alex was saying he went to a new fathers group, and that, but you called it an AA meeting, and that, you know, it almost pathologizes it in a way that I don't think there's so many opportunities for men to sit with each other or with women or whomever and just talk about childbirth. I mean, where does that happen? And even for women, you know, my children are a little bit older now, so I can't go to new mothers groups. It's a kind of private conversation. And the book, I talk about it being like the way veterans share war stories. It's kind of whispered in private. And there's a part of the experience that will probably always remain private, but there's also, I think, public discussions that can be had. So thank you very much for your interest and comment.
Thank you, Todd. Next, let's go to Michael. Hi, Michael.
Hi, thanks so much for all this. I've written not so much notes, but just tons of little words, which I don't usually do through these. But one of the things that popped out was there's a statement by Bohr in Science that science, I think it's Bohr, Alex would know, probably, is science progresses one funeral at a time. But it's kind of weird to think about it flipped, like it progresses one birth at a time. And it's interesting because like death is kind of definitive, right? It's dead. It's like dead bits of matter type thing. I mean, I'm kind of biased from like an old world poetry perspective, but you seem to be, and I mean this in the most respectful way, playing with these ideas that are unbounded. Birth, the future, these generative, not so much survival based things. And I guess the question that I have is, do you think, I mean, this is pure opinion or perspective, but do you think that part of it is because we tend to get stuck in survival mode in our modern Western culture and look at things like creativity, perhaps even the arts, as being frivolous? Or do you have like a completely different perspective?
Mm-hmm.
So,
in terms of why death somehow seems more manageable
no,
for us.
why people avoid like the birth or creative, like non-bounded, something that would require, in my perspective, more description and less definition to kind of.
Well, you know, some of it goes back to the comments I made in the beginning, just about how it's hard to think about birth and the reasons for that. I think there are things that are probably distinct to our moment that encourage us to think more about death. You know, I think there are so many threats, even though we are in some way safer than we've ever been before. Our lives, we live longer lives. So we live further in time generally from both birth and death. I think that's part of it, is that, you know, if you were in a culture where people only lived to be 35, you experienced birth and death more regularly. There were higher birth rates. There were higher death rates. Often many children didn't live to be 3 or 4 or 5. And so I think there was, you know, I don't know.
No,
but
this is generally like what's kind of like, what is this spark? Or,
I think we get insulated from these experiences, and I'm focusing on birth, but I think it's probably true of death. Although, you know, I think people still sense it there, and you know, there's a kind of tradition and culture of thinking about it. But birth, you know, birth is also goes against a kind of individualism. You know, we can die alone. We can take our own. There's a kind of agency. You know, there's also a lack of agency because many of us wouldn't choose to die the ways or the times that we do. But birth, you know, we had very little to do with our own births from what we know. And we needed other people to be born. So this is a kind of hard thing to think about when we're so trained in a kind of individualistic worldview that trains us to think we're in control of our worlds in many ways.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it's just, and it reminds me of, there's a couple of dialogue groups that I'm in, and it reminds me of when, like, a dear friend, she's like, well, what do you guys think of immortality? And almost everyone went right to death, which is normally a taboo topic, but it seemed like, and her and I kind of circled back afterwards, and she's like, did you notice everybody avoided this immortality concept? And they went right to death.
Yeah.
Which I hadn't picked up on. So it's kind of like, you know, birth, and then you mentioned the future, right? It's two of your kind of go-to or curious topics, but they're kind of unbounded.
Yeah, and this is why Hannah Arendt talked about birth as a miracle. And she talked about it as a surprise and this spontaneous unleashing of a sequence of events that we can't foresee, and that there's no way to predict. It's a miracle. It's what's never been seen before. And this is why I think she thought that birth went so much against totalitarianism, which was so much about control and about a human mastery of saying, you know, we can create these death boundaries, we can colonize, we can control our subjects. It was the surprise of birth and the kind of messiness and the kind of chaos of it. I think that's the thing that runs the book too, is there's a chaotic energy in birth that is very disruptive and threatening.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Let's see. Gary, did you want to come in?
Well, I just have a question about, you know, birth versus death and the relationship between potentiality and actuality, right? That birth, in a sense, is a transition from potentiality, which we might think of as a spiritual realm, into physical actuality. And in that sense, it really is a miracle, right? I mean, it is something that was not, that becomes something that is, right? And so where that happens and where that comes from seems like a manifestation of this kind of connection between the purely relational and non-physical and the world that we inhabit of physical actuality. Death is the inverse of that, right? It's the transition back to the relational realm of possibility from our physical actuality. I'm wondering how you might see that, right? As a reason for why we might be so taken by, right, and drawn into, you know, contemplating the whole idea of the birth process.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say. I think there's something really there, though. I think it's a really interesting comment. I mean, part of what birth gives us is suddenly given. You know, it's there, and death, in a weird way, is the realm of possibilities because we have no idea. You know, the kind of promise of birth or the gestation is the period of hope, and birth is the moment of recognition. You know, I think for many people who've been through seeing a child born or having a child, part of the shock is that this isn't like a blank slate. This is a person who actually has their own being. I think in Eastern traditions, it would be karma, and, you know, in Christianity or, you know, other spiritual traditions, it might be soul or spirit or a sense of history. I had a sense that there was an experience there. There was a reality of a person that wasn't unlimited. You know, the future was all before them, but there were inclinations, there were habits, there were fears, there were you know, likes or dislikes. That was all sort of there from the beginning.
I think each of us who is a parent, you know, has imprinted on our mind the first time we encountered, you know, our child as a separate individual, as a separate living being. and just the recognition of what will happen, right? How will their life unfold?
Gary, your comment is so beautiful, because it made me think of birth and death as kind of the solstices of life, because you're talking about the actual and the virtual, or the actual and the potential, and I think we know philosophically that these are two modes of existence that play with each other all the time, but perhaps there are two big events, like two big solstices, which is when the portal opens for kind of the pure virtual to become actual. And then, as you said, there's another portal at the end, which is, well, now it's the same thing in reverse. And so this just symbolizes like this ongoing dance, this processual dance. It has very special moments, and birth is one of them.
And I think that quantum physics gives us some hints about this, particularly the transactional interpretation, where one has a quantum substratum, which is outside of space-time, where things happen that shape what will occur, what will emerge into space-time. That's the quantum realm. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I don't have at all a grasp on the science to comment with any authority, but I will say in giving birth, I had a very altered experience of time surrounding the event. And it was 2 or 3 days where it was a sense that time had just torn. I was in this clearing, and then it kind of came back, and, you got a sense of 24 hours in a day and night. But there was a period where, there was a breaking through, and it felt like the fabric of reality was torn in some way. It's very hard to put into language without it sounding very esoteric.
And one more acknowledgement here, because I think we haven't mentioned, so many women have died giving birth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just birth and death somewhere later. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, often, this has happened together, so these portals can meet. It's devastating, but that life is raw in that sense too. Mm.
Yeah, and you hear about this a lot with the abortion debate, but what people talk about much less is miscarriage. The rates of natural miscarriage are very, very high. And from what we know, they probably always have been. That, death is deeply interwoven into birth. To the point where they're inseparable, and this, of course, the mothers were at risk in giving birth too. And this was part of life that I think when women were giving birth a lot and when they were dying, it was imbued with this kind of sacred but terrifying status. As the destroyer. In the opening passages of the book, I talk about Enheduanna, who's the earliest known author in world history from modern day Iraq. She was a poet and priestess, and she talks about that goddess of childbirth's temple. She has a kind of hymn of praise to it, and she talks about it as glorious and beautiful and full of wrath. I think that was, and the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible accounts of Genesis, of birth is wound up in exile and kind of epic fall from paradise and loss. These things aren't separable.
Great. Thank you, Gary. So we have unfortunately reached the end. So thank you for everyone who has come in for questions. Just sort of for concluding remarks, just like to come back to you to Alex and Jennifer to see if you have anything to leave us with.
Yeah, I'm prepared because James always comes back for remarks. So I know you don't, Jennifer. So I want to say as a remark to borrow the dedication of your book, Jennifer, and just extend it to, so for our families, past, present, and future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I for my part, will just say that the book was intended, as I write in the book, as an invitation into natality, and an invitation into a way of thinking, and perhaps a set of exercises, and a way of imagining. And, you know, I encourage you to embark on this project yourself too, and to share it with your communities, not necessarily even my book, but just to continue the conversations in your communities.
Well, thank you both for such an important conversation that you both had, and thank you to everyone who came in with their comments, their powerful comments, and of course, thank you to everyone who contributed in the chat. There was lots going on there, so if you have a chance, feel free to have a read through that. Just before we go, I'd just like to remind everyone that we will be having our third installment of our series Beyond BOEM, curated by Lee Nicol, which will run between the 16th and 30th of July. It will be a 3-week dive into the work and developments rooted from the ideas of David Bohm. In this series, we will be joined by several experts, collaborators, and colleagues of Bohm, discussing various themes and where Bohm's work has led them. So I hope to see you then. In the meantime, we do have plenty on YouTube and our website to look at. Thank you again, both of you, and thank you, everyone. We'll see you again soon here at the Power Center.